officers of the 53rd and several of the most respectable inhabitants, the officers of St. Helena Corps and their wives, were introduced to Napoleon, at whose table some were weekly invited to dine, and amongst them Mr. Doveton, Miss Doveton, Colonel and Mrs. Skelton, Captain and Mrs. Younghusband, Mr. Balcombe and family, officers and other respectable passengers from India and China came in numbers to Longwood to request a presentation to the fallen chief, in which expectation they were rarely disappointed, unless indisposition on his part or the shortness of their stay on the island prevented it. Many ladies and gentlemen who came up at an inconvenient time have remained in my room long after the foretopsail of the ship which was to waft them to England was loosed, in the hope of Napoleon's presenting himself at the windows of his apartment. I have frequently been unable to withstand the solicitations of more than one anxious fair expectant to place some of the servants of the house in a situation where they might be enabled to apprise them of his approach to the windows or door of the drawing room, whereby they might be afforded an opportunity of stealing a glance at the renowned captain. Some short time after his arrival at Longwood, I communicated to him the news of Murat's death. He heard it with calmness, and immediately demanded if he had perished on the field of battle. At first I hesitated to tell him that his brother-in-law had been executed like a criminal. On his repeating the question, I informed him of the manner in which Murat had been put to death, which he listened to without any change of countenance. I also communicated the intelligence of the death of Ney. He was a brave man, nobody more so, but he was a madman, said he. He died without having the esteem of mankind. He betrayed me at Fontainebleau. The proclamation against the Bourbons, which he said in his defense I caused to be given him, was written by himself, and I never knew anything about that document until it was read to the troops. It is true that I sent him orders to obey me. What could he do? His troops abandoned him. Not only the troops, but the people who wished to join me. I had lent him Miss Williams' Present State of France to read. 2 or 3 days afterwards, he said to me while dressing, "That is a vile production of that lady of yours. It is a heap of falsehoods. This," opening his shirt and showing his flannel waistcoat, "is the only coat of mail I ever wore. My hat lined with steel, too. There is the hat I wore," pointing to the one he always carried. "Oh, she has doubtless been well paid for all the malice and falsehoods she has poured forth." Napoleon's hours of rising were uncertain, much depending upon the quantum of rest he had enjoyed during the night. He was in general a bad sleeper and frequently got up at 3 or 4 o'clock, in which case he read or wrote until 6 or 7, at which time, when the weather was fine, he sometimes went out to ride, attended by some of his generals, or lay down again to rest for a couple of hours. When he retired to bed, he could not sleep unless the most perfect state of darkness was obtained by the closure of every cranny through which a ray of light might pass. Although I have sometimes seen him fall asleep on the sofa and remain so for a few minutes in broad daylight, when ill Marchand occasionally read to him until he fell asleep. At times he rose at 7 and rose or dictated until breakfast time, or if the morning was very fine, he went out to ride. When he breakfasted in his own room, it was generally served on a little round table at between 9 and 10, went along with the rest of his suite at 11, in either case à la fourchette. After breakfast, he generally dictated to some of his suite for a few hours, and at 2 or 3 o'clock received such visitors as by previous appointment had been directed to present themselves. Between 4 and 5, when the weather permitted, he rode out on horseback or in the carriage, accompanied by all his suite, for an hour or 2, then returned and dictated or read until 8, or occasionally played a game at chess, at which time dinner was announced, which rarely exceeded 20 minutes or half an hour in duration. He ate heartily and fast, and did not appear to be partial to high-seasoned or rich food. One of his most favorite dishes was a roasted leg of mutton, of which I have seen him sometimes pare the outside brown part off. He was also partial to mutton chops. He rarely drank as much as a pint of claret at his dinner, which was generally much diluted with water. After dinner, when the servants had withdrawn, and when there were no visitors, he sometimes played at chess or at whist, but more frequently sent for a volume of Corneille, or of some other esteemed author, and read aloud for an hour, or chatted with the ladies and the rest of his suite. He usually retired to his bedroom at 10 or 11, and to rest immediately afterwards. When he breakfasted or dined in his own apartment, dans l'intérieur, he sometimes sent for one of his suite to converse with him during the repast. He never ate more than 2 meals a day, nor, since I knew him, had he ever taken more than a very small cup of coffee after each repast, and at no other time. I have also been informed by those who have been in his service for 15 years that he had never exceeded that quantity since they first knew him. On the 14th of April, the Phaeton frigate Captain Stanfield arrived from England, having on board Lieutenant General Sir Hudson Lowe, Lady Lowe, Sir Thomas Reed, Deputy Adjutant General Major Grecker, aide-de-camp to Sir Hudson Lowe, Lieutenant Colonel Leicester, Inspector of Militia, Major Emmett of the Engineers, Mr. Baxter, Deputy Inspector of the Hospitals, Lieutenants Witham and Jackson of the Engineers and Staff Corps, and other officers. The following day, Sir Hudson Lowe landed and was installed as governor, with the customary forms. A message was then sent to Longwood that the new governor would visit Napoleon at 9 o'clock on the following morning. Accordingly, a little before that time, Sir Hudson Lowe arrived in the midst of a pelting storm of rain and wind, accompanied by Sir George Cockburn, and followed by his numerous staff, as the hour fixed upon was rather unseasonable, and one at which Napoleon had never received any person. Intimation was given to the governor on his arrival that Napoleon was indisposed. They could not receive any visitors that morning. This appeared to disconcert Sir Hudson Lowe, who, after pacing up and down before the windows of the drawing-room for a few minutes, demanded at what time on the following day he could be introduced. 2 o'clock was fixed upon for the interview, at which time he arrived, accompanied as before by the admiral and followed by his staff. They were first ushered into the dining-room, behind which was the saloon, where they were to be received. A proposal was made by Sir George Cockburn to Sir Hudson Lowe that the latter should be introduced by him as being, in his opinion, the most official and proper manner of resigning to him the charge of the prisoner, for which purpose Sir George suggested that they should enter the room together. This was acceded to by Sir Hudson Lowe. At the door of the drawing-room stood Navarre, one of the French valets, whose business it was to announce the names of the persons introduced. After waiting a few minutes, the door was opened and the governor called for. As soon as the word governor was pronounced, Sir Hudson Lowe started up and stepped forward so hastily that he entered the room before Sir George Cockburn was well apprised of it. The door was then closed, and when the admiral presented himself, the valet, not having heard the name called, told him that he could not enter. Sir Hudson Lowe remained about a quarter of an hour with Napoleon, during which time a conversation was chiefly carried on in Italian, and subsequently the officers of his staff were introduced. The admiral did not again apply for admittance. On the 18th, I brought up some newspapers to Napoleon, who, after asking me some questions concerning the meeting of Parliament, inquired who had let the newspapers. I replied the admiral had lent them to me. Napoleon said, I believe that he was rather ill-treated the day he came up with the new governor. What does he say about it? I replied the admiral conceived it was an insult offered to him, and certainly felt greatly offended by it. Some explanation was, however, been given by General Montsolon on the subject. Napoleon said, I shall never see him with pleasure, but he did not announce himself as being desirous of seeing me. I replied, I wished to introduce officially to you the new governor, and thought that as he was to act in that capacity, it was not necessary to be previously announced. Napoleon answered, he should have sent me word that he wanted to see me by Bertrand, but, continued he wished to embroil me with the new governor, and for that purpose persuaded him to come up here at 9 o'clock in the morning, though he well knew that I never had received any persons, or never would at that hour. It is a pity that a man who really has talents, for I believe him to be a very good officer in his own service, should have behaved in the manner he has done to me. It shows the greatest want of generosity to insult the unfortunate, because insulting those who are in your power and consequently cannot make any opposition is a certain sign of an ignoble mind. I said that I was perfectly convinced the whole was a mistake, that the admiral never had the smallest intention of insulting or embroiling him with the governor. He resumed, I, in my misfortune, sought an asylum, and instead of that I have found contempt, ill treatment, and insult. Surely after I came on board of his ship, I did not wish to sit down at table for 2 or 3 hours, guzzling down wine to make myself drunk. I got up from table and walked out upon deck. While I was going out, he said in a contemptuous manner, I believe the general has never read Lord Chesterfield, meaning that I was deficient in politeness and did not know how to conduct myself at table. I endeavored to explain to him that the English, and above all naval officers, were not in the habit of going through many forms, and that it was wholly unintentional on the part of the admiral. If, said he, Sir George wanted to see Lord St. Vincent or Lord Keith, would he not have sent beforehand and asked at what hour it might be convenient to see him? And should not I be treated with at least as much respect as either of them, putting out of the question that I have been a crowned head, I think? Said he, laughing, that the actions which I have performed are at least as well known as anything they have done. I endeavored again to excuse the admiral, upon which he recalled to my mind what he had just related about Lord Chesterfield, and asked me, what could that mean? General Montholon came in at this moment with the translation of a paper sent by Sir Hudson Lowe, which the domestics which were willing to remain were required to sign. It was accompanied by the following letter: Downing Street, 10th January, 1816. This is in French. All right, I don't have to do All right. Je dois à présent te vous faire connaître que le plaisir de SAR, le prince régent, est qu'à votre arrière et à son talent, que vous communiqueriez à toutes les personnes de sa suite de Napoléon Bonaparte, y compris les serviteurs domestiques qui sont libres de quitter l'île immédiatement. But, all right, this is where they're saying that everybody has to leave Napoleon if they don't agree to share his exile indefinitely. The tenor of the accompanying declaration, which the domestics were thus required to sign, was not approved of by Napoleon, who moreover pronounced it to be, literally translated, to be easily comprehended by a Frenchman. He accordingly desired Count Montholon to retire into the next room, where the following was substituted. Nous sont signés voulons continuer à rester au service de Sa Majesté le Preux Napoléon, consentant quelque œuvre que soit le séjour de Sainte-Hélène à y rester. Nous soumettons aux restrictions injustes et arbitraires qu'on a imposées à Son Majesté et aux personnes de son service. So everybody agrees to share all of Napoleon's restrictions. There said he, let those who please sign that, but do not attempt to influence them either one way or another. The demand made to the domestics to sign the paper sent by Sir H. Lowe had produced a wish for further explanation amongst them, and some who applied to Sir Thomas Reed for that purpose received answers of a nature to inculcate a belief that those who signed it would be compelled to remain in the island during the lifetime of Bonaparte. This, however, did not prevent any of them from signing the paper which was presented to them. 19th. The weather has been extremely bad for some days, which has contributed with other circumstances to make Napoleon a little dissatisfied. In this Isola Maladetta, this cursed island, said he, there is neither sun nor moon to be seen for the greatest part of the year, constant rain and fog. It is worse than Capri. Have you ever been at Capri? Continued he. I replied in the affirmative. There, said he, you can have everything you want from the continent in a few hours. He afterwards made a few remarks upon some absurd falsehoods which had been published in the ministerial papers respecting him, and asked if it were possible that the English could be so foolishly credulous as to believe all the stuff we published about him. 21st. Captain Hamilton of the Havana frigate had an audience with Napoleon in the garden. Napoleon told him that when he, Napoleon, had arrived on the island, he had been asked what he desired to have. He therefore begged of him to say that he desired his liberty, or le bourreau, the executioner, that the English ministers had unworthily violated the most sacred rights of hospitality towards him by declaring him a prisoner, which savages would not have done in the situation in which he stood. Colonel and Miss Wilkes were to proceed to England in the Havana. Before the departure, they came up to Longwood and had a long interview with Napoleon. He was highly pleased with Miss Wilkes, a highly accomplished and elegant young lady, and gallantly told her that she exceeded the description which had been given to her of him. The 24th. The weather still gloomy. Napoleon at first was out of spirits, but gradually became enlivened, conversed much about the admiral whom he professed to esteem as a man of talent in his profession. He is not, said he, a man of bad heart. On the contrary, I believe him to be capable of a generous action, but he is rough, overbearing, vain, choleric, and capricious, never consulting anybody, jealous of his authority, caring little of the manner in which he exercises it, and sometimes violent without dignity. He then made some observations about the bullocks, which had been brought from the Cape of Good Hope by the government, and amongst which a great mortality had taken place. The admiral said he ought to have contracted for them instead of making them government property. It is well known that whatever belongs to a government is never taken any care of and is plundered by everybody. If he had contracted with some person, I will venture to say very few would have died instead of a third, as has been the case. He then asked me many questions about the relative price of articles in England and St. Helena, and concluded by asking me if I took any fees for attending the sick people on the island. I replied in the negative, which seemed to surprise him. Corvisart, said he, notwithstanding his being my first physician, possessed of great wealth, and in the habit of receiving many rich presents from me, constantly took Napoleon for each visit he paid to the sick. In your country, particularly, every man has his trade. The member of Parliament takes money for his vote, the ministers for their places, the lawyers for their opinion. The 29th. Napoleon asked several questions relative to the ships which had been seen to approach the island, was anxious to know if Lady Bingham, who had been expected for some time, had arrived, observed how anxious Sir George Bingham must be about her, asked me if the ship was furnished with a chronometer by government, to which I replied in the negative. He observed that the vessel might very probably miss the island through the want of one. How shameful it is, said he, for your government to put 300 or 400 men on board of a ship destined for this place without a chronometer, thereby running the risk of shipping cargo of the value perhaps of 500,000, together with the lives of so many poveri diavoli, poor devils, for the sake of saving 300 or 400 francs for a watch. I, continued he, ordered that every ship employed in the French service should be supplied with one. It is a weakness in your government not to be accounted for. He then asked me if it were true that a court of inquiry was then holding upon some officer for having made too free with the bottle. Is it a crime, added he, for the English to get drunk? And will a court-martial be the consequence? For if that were the case, you would have nothing but court-martials every day. Was a little merry on board every day after dinner. I observed that there was a wide difference between being merry and getting drunk. He laughed and repeated what he had said relative to court-martials. It is true, said he then, that they are sending out a house and furniture for me, as there are so many lies in your newspapers that I have my doubts, especially as I have heard nothing about it officially. I I told him that Sir Hudson Lowe had assured me of the fact, and that Sir Thomas Reed professed to have seen both the house and the furniture. Many changes relative to the treatment of the French have taken place since Sir Hudson arrived. Mr. Brooke, the Colonel's secretary, Major Gurker, Sir Hudson's aide-de-camp, and other official persons went round to the different shopkeepers in the town, ordering them, in the name of the governor, not to give credit to any of the French, or to sell them any articles, unless for ready money, under pain of not only losing the amount of the sum so credited, but of suffering such other punishment as the governor might think proper to award. They were further directed to hold no communication whatsoever with them, without special permission from the governor, under pain of being turned off the island. Many of the officers of the 53rd, who were in the habit of calling to see Madame Bertrand at Hutsgate, received hints that their visits were not pleasing to the authorities lately arrived, and the officer of the Hutsgate Guard were ordered to report the names of all persons entering Bertrand's house. Sentinels were placed in different directions to prevent the approach of visitors, several of whom, including some ladies, were turned back. A sensation of unwillingness, or rather fear, to approach the exiles, very different from the feeling which existed a few days ago, appeared to be pretty general amongst the inhabitants, and even amongst the military and naval officers. The governor was very minute in his inquiries to those persons who had formerly conversed with Napoleon, or any of his suite. Several of the officers of the 53rd went to Hutsgate to take leave of Countess Bertrand, to use their own words, as they declared the impossibility there was for men of honor to comply with the new regulations. It was expected and required that all persons who visited at Hutsgate or at Logwood should make a report of the conversations they held with the French to the governor or to Sir Thomas Reed. Several additional sentinels were placed around Logwood House and guards. May 3rd. The weather has been extremely wet and foggy. The high wind for several days, during which time Napoleon did not stir out of doors. Messengers and letters continually arrived from Plantation House. The governor was apparently very anxious to see Napoleon, and seemed distrustful enough. Although the residents of Longwood were assured of his actual presence by the sound of his voice, he had some communications with Count Bertrand relative to the necessity, which he said there was, that some of his officers should see Napoleon daily. He also came to Longwood frequently himself, and finally, after some difficulty, succeeded in obtaining an interview with Napoleon in his bedchamber, which lasted about a quarter of an hour. Some days before, he sent for me, and asked a variety of questions concerning the captive, walked round the house several times, and before the windows, measuring and laying down the plans of a new ditch, which he said he would have dug, in order to prevent the cattle from trespassing. On his arrival at the angle formed by the union of two of the old ditches, he observed a tree, the branch of which considerably overhung it. This appeared to excite considerable alarm in His Excellency's breast, as he desired me to send instantly for Mr. Porteous, the superintendent of the company's gardens. Some minutes having elapsed after I had dispatched a messenger for that gentleman, the governor, who had his eyes continually fixed upon the tree, desired me, in a hasty manner, to go and fetch Mr. Porteous instantly myself. On my return with him, I found Sir Hudson Lowe walking up and down, contemplating the object which appeared to be such a source of alarm. In a hurried manner, he ordered Mr. Porteous to send some men instantly to have the tree grubbed up, and before leaving the ground directed me, in an undertone, to see that it was done. On the 4th, Sir Hudson Lowe went to see Count Bertrand, with whom he had an hour's conversation, which did not appear to be of a nature very pleasing to him, as on retiring he mounted his horse, muttering something, and evidently out of humor. Shortly afterwards, I learned the purpose of the visit. He commenced by saying that the French made a great many complaints without any reason, that considering their situation, they were very well treated, and ought to be thankful, instead of making any complaints. It appeared to him, however, that instead of being so, they abused the liberal treatment which was practiced towards them, that he was determined to assure himself of General Bonaparte's actual presence daily, by the observations of an officer appointed to him, and that this officer should visit him at fixed hours for such purpose. During the whole of it, He spoke in a very authoritative and indeed contemptuous manner, frequently referring to the great powers with which he was invested.